When we left class last time, we were in the midst of talking about some of the important intellectual things that had come to Japan from Korea and China during the 6th century. We had completed talking about Buddhism, which of course had a huge impact religiously, but also socially, politically, and economically on Japan. And we're in the midst of talking about Confucianism. In this video, I'm going to continue talking about Confucianism and then talking about the writing system, which maybe was more important than anything else in what came over from the continent. A little bit of review of what we covered last class, or may have been close to covering last class. Confucianism, as you guys recall, was created by somebody named Confucius, or at least that we call Confucius, around the 6th, 5th century BCE in China. He was well educated and wanted to help fix the problems of his time. He lived in an era in which China was falling into a period that would be called the Age of the Warring States. He was trained in etiquette, and therefore he viewed the world in that lens, how people related with each other, and thought that that would be the best way to restore order. Excuse me. He and his followers developed what we now call the 3 cardinal principles of morality. These are the basic sets of morality that individuals needed to follow. As you may remember from last class, Confucianism viewed everything as being interconnected. The cosmos was connected to the government and the ruler. They were connected to society, which was connected to families, which of course was made up of individuals. If any part of that was in disarray or in disorder, it was. The 3 cardinal principles, of course, dictated the order of all of that, but in particular needed to be followed by individuals. The 4 social classes, of course, provided the boxes and the descriptions of how society should work. Once again, if this was not followed well, then everything could be in disorder. The 5 relationships, which we haven't yet talked about in class, excuse me, were mostly about the relationship between family members, but also included relationships beyond that. All of these relationships were guided by a hierarchy. Confucianism was not a democracy. It believed that order was achieved when people knew who to follow or who they were leading. And therefore, all of this is dictated by that. And a word that I did not start in class yet is reciprocity. All these relationships were also guided by reciprocity. What that means is that each side of the relationship has a duty to the other. Just because you're a superior does not mean that you can treat your inferiors badly or do whatever you want. You have an obligation to them. So really quickly to review some of this for one of the classes and get to new stuff for another class. The 3 cardinal principles broke down to humaneness, filial piety, and ritual. Humaneness was, of course, being kind to one another. Remember, human is part of humaneness. It was realizing that we are all connected together as humans, and that because of that, everybody should treat others as they wanted to be treated. A Chinese version or a Confucian version of the Golden Rule. Filial piety was the most important of all morality. This was the morality that said that you needed to show respect, obedience, and loyalty to your parents, your grandparents, and your ancestors. The reason this was considered the most important of all the principles was because it was the first principle you would learn. Your relationship with your parents from the moment you're a baby is the one that would guide the rest of your life. If you learned how to behave properly in this relationship, the thinking was, then you would be able to behave properly in all relationships after that. And finally was ritual. Ritual, as we talked about in class, was the idea of performing or putting into action your morality, sometimes in a big, very sort of sacred kind of way, perhaps something like a ceremony to show respect for your ancestors once a year, but also in small ways that you ritualistically or habitually or repeatedly did again and again. This ritual was supposed to remind you of what your beliefs were and to remind you to stay close to those beliefs. If individuals across China and across the cosmos, I suppose, were able to follow these three cardinal principles, it would do a lot in maintaining order. If people were kind to each other, there wouldn't be as much conflict. If people knew who their leaders were, who they were supposed to be respectful and obedient to, then there would be less disorder. The four social classes were classes that Confucius and his students determined were just the basic social units that people were born into. Confucianism was not a democracy, as I said. It was also not something that believed in social mobility. It did not have the belief that if you worked hard, you could move up and go from one social class to the next. The idea was that things like that were disorderly. You were born into a social class. You needed to do what the duties of that social class were. You needed to interact with people within that social class and not intermingle too much with people outside of that social class. And then if that was achieved, there would be order in society, which would then again help with the interconnectedness of everything being ordered. At the top of the four social classes were scholars. Not just any scholars, but specifically scholars of Confucian morality. This essentially equated to the elites, the highest social class. The idea was that those in a position to get a good education should get it in Confucianism. And if they did this, they should be the leaders of society and the examples for everybody else. They should provide the example of how everybody else should behave. Underneath them were farmers. Even though we tend to think of farmers as living lives with less money perhaps and more struggle, they were put second on this list because they were considered the backbone of society or the backbone of the economy. While a good morality was the most important thing for everybody to have, being able to eat food was the next most important thing, and farmers provided that food. Without farmers, society would collapse, Confucianists believe. Most of society at this point were farmers. Something probably around 85–90% of the population would have been working on farms. So this accounted for most of that group. Third on the list in this hierarchy were artisans. These were the people that made things but did not necessarily grow food. They built homes, they made paintings, they constructed sculptures, they made tools. Pretty much anybody who made something was part of this group. They were not considered quite as important as farmers because farmers made food, which everybody has to have. And they certainly weren't considered as important as scholars because scholars were the leaders, the examples, and the ones who could show everybody else what Confucian morality was about. But they did provide something. They did make something for society. Last on the list were merchants. Merchants were the people that moved goods around and sold them to others. They were seen as necessary for a society, but they were also seen as people that didn't produce anything of their own and therefore should be on the bottom. In addition, Confucianists tended to mistrust those who were guided by money. Money, could lead people into disorder, and merchants were seen as the most likely to be in that position. So those were the four social classes, and if the various dictates of those classes were held firm, then once again we could retain the interconnectedness of order. Next were our five relationships. Just like Confucianists had defined four social classes, they defined five basic relationships, five basic and important relationships that everybody was a part of. One of these relationships was on a big level. That was the ruler-subject relationship. In this relationship, the thinking was that the ruler should provide for his people policies which made them able to live decently, right? Policies that ensured that crops would come in and help feed everybody, policies that would ensure that the people of the country were protected. That was his duty. Now, of course, he didn't farm. He just made sure the conditions were such that the people were taken care of and that he and his government were not taking advantage of people. The reciprocity here, right, mutually giving and taking, was that the subjects, the people underneath the ruler and underneath the government, had to provide obedience and loyalty and respect for the government. They did not protest, they didn't rise up against the government. These were the things that were their obligations. If both sides provided what they were supposed to, then we could think of the government being in order and society being in order, and then hopefully the whole cosmos would be in order. Next, after the ruler-subject relationship, another one of these 5 relationships was the friend-friend relationship. This was the only relationship that had the potential for equality, not a hierarchy. In this relationship, though, people should be providing humaneness to each other, of course, to reduce conflict. The 3 other relationships are all focused on family. Relationships is husband-wife, but it runs the exact same way as the ruler-subject relationship. The duty of the husband is to provide protection, make sure that his wife is safe and taken care of, and also to provide moral example, moral teaching, moral education to his wife. And of course, morality here is Confucian values. In response, women were supposed to be obedient, loyal, and respectful to their husbands. Confucianism was patriarchal, meaning it said that men were superior, and we see that in this relationship. Another family relationship that helps fill out our 5 relationships here is older sibling, younger sibling. But it runs the same as the others. The older sibling, because he's older, is seen as superior. The younger sibling is seen as inferior. The older sibling provides moral guidance, protection, takes care of the younger sibling. In response, in reciprocity, the younger sibling provides respect, obedience, and loyalty to the older sibling. And then finally is the parent-child relationship. This one, of course, is dictated like the filial piety that we talked about in the 3 cardinal principles. But remember, it's just like all these others as well. The parent has a responsibility to the child, protect, take care of, and morally educate the child. The child then should be respectful, obedient, and loyal to the parent. And those are the basics of Confucianism. Over the years, much is added to this. And there are lots of different other different ideas that are related to Confucianism. These are the very basic ideas. All right, so we've talked about Buddhism, we've talked a little bit about Taoism in class, and we've talked about Confucianism. The one other really important intellectual type of thing that came over to Japan via Korea, but all of these things really are shaped by China, is the writing system. Before the 6th century, Japan did not have a writing system and therefore did not have what we would call civilization. You need a writing system to be able to build a complex government, complex laws, complex religion. You need a writing system to be able to develop a more intricate economy. All of these things are predicated on being able to record things. Of course, you cannot really develop literary culture as well because you can't write anything. The writing system Japan started to take on the Chinese writing system in the 6th century, and this is kind of important. The Chinese writing system is a writing system that was created to best record Chinese, spoken Chinese. It does not fit spoken Japanese very well. The Japanese and the Chinese have very different oral languages. But the Japanese imported the Chinese writing system and used it. What that means is that to be able to write, at least initially, the Japanese had to learn Chinese. They spoke in Japanese, but they wrote in Chinese. And in fact, writing in Chinese was seen as better, as more prestigious, and therefore important documents, so scholars when they wrote things, or the government when it recorded things, this was all done in Chinese even up to the end of the 19th century, so over 1,000 years. The Japanese did adapt the Chinese writing system eventually so that it could better reflect their system, and they turned it into what we call written Japanese, which uses some Chinese characters but also simplifies some Chinese characters so that they can a combination of regular Chinese characters and simplifies Chinese characters they can use in order to deal with Japanese grammar and things that that are different from the Chinese spoken language. For those of you who are not aware, the Chinese system of writing is logographic. That means each character, yes, has a sound associated with it, but it's not phonetic like our alphabet. The important meaning in the writing system is not the sound, it's that each one of these characters represents a word. That's what logogram or logographic means. So if we look at this, we see on the right, this is what Chinese looks like. You can kind of tell the more complicated characters, each one of these representing a different word strung together, and they reflect Chinese. Chinese is very, very difficult to learn to read and very, very difficult to learn to speak. It's difficult to learn to speak because it has lots of different tones. That means when you say a syllable, for example, ba, depending on how you say ba, it can mean a lot of different things. And so therefore Chinese is very difficult. But what is not difficult about Chinese is the grammatical system. The Chinese have a very simple grammatical system. The Japanese, on the other hand, have a very complicated grammatical system. And that was one of the challenges in adapting this. They adapted the Chinese writing system to the Japanese writing system. And maybe you can see here, it's a little blurry, but some of the characters are more complicated. In fact, look at this character and look at this character. They're the same. Look at this character. Look at this character. They're the same. But you'll also notice the more simple characters. This one, this one, this one, this one, this one. These characters are used to help create verbs that fit better into the Japanese grammar. They're sometimes used to, in a string, these more simplified ones, to represent a phonetic spelling of a word. Some characters like this one help give the Japanese an understanding of things like prepositions, at, with, to. So it's different. However, like I said, in these early stages, to be able to write in Japan meant to be able to write Chinese. Eventually, this is what the extra characters are that are created by the Japanese. You can see that they're much simpler than the Chinese. And they represent sounds. This is a phonetic system. It's not exactly like our alphabet. Our alphabet represents very sort of distinct sounds. This is a phonetic system that represents syllables. A, I, U, E, O, Ka, Ki, Ku, Ke, Ko, Sa, Shi, Su, Se, So, Ta, Chi, Tsu, Te, To, instead of A, Ba, Ka, as we have in our alphabet. We'll talk a little bit more in class about how the Chinese created their characters. The Japanese actually had to create two of these phonetic systems, one called hiragana, the other called katakana. And so with a combination of Chinese characters and then these two syllabary, the Japanese write today. It's a lot more to learn than what we have with the alphabet. So at the end of the 6th century, or at least during the 6th century, what we have is Japan importing a lot of these things. Politically, we have the Yamato Uji, or the Yamato clan, which sits atop a confederacy of other Uji, or other clans. But it's not strong enough to actually control everything. It sort of sits atop an alliance. That's what this confederacy is. It's a little stronger than the others. And yes, it provides a little more centralization as some of these clans, these important clans, are in service. But we don't have the creation of a strong state yet. However, we're moving in that direction. In addition to these things that we just talked about, Confucianism and Buddhism and a writing system, which will all be used by the Yamato to create more strength and more centralization and eventually a state government. In addition to that, the Japanese also, or the Yamato, also start to import some things from Pekcha, one of the kingdoms of the Korean Peninsula, to help in terms of creating this new government. One is that they adopt a system of the oldest son of the main wife to become the next ruler. So they set some kind of safety or security in how you pass leadership from one ruler to the next. And then secondly, they introduced something called the Kabane system. It was a system of ranks and titles that the Yamato started handing out to members of their own Uji, yes, but to other Ujis as well. And in doing so, it created this prestige in these ranks, which helped unify people underneath them. It helped sort of create a unity because everybody was sort of starting to operate under a system of ranks, which didn't exist before. This is where we are in the 6th century, but we're going to build on our understanding in the 6th century to understand what gets us to Japan finally creating an imperial government.